The Hawthorne estate stretched across acres of golden meadows, bordered by white wooden fences and rolling hills. It was the kind of land that seemed to whisper history, generations of proud, wealthy landowners who had cultivated not just crops and horses, but a reputation of elegance and tradition. Nestled in the heart of the estate stood the main house, a grand two-story farmhouse with wraparound porches, ivy trailing across its white columns, and windows that glowed amber in the early morning light. For as long as anyone could remember, Hawthorne Farm had been the crown jewel of the county, and its residents the royalty of the rural elite. Eleanor Hawthorne had lived there all her life. At 29, she was the last of the Hawthorne daughters still unmarried. Her older sisters, Catherine and Isabel, had long fulfilled their expected roles, marrying influential men, bearing children, and hosting charity galas in nearby towns. Their photos decorated the hallways, locked in ornate silver frames. Catherine on her wedding day, beaming beside a senator's son. Isabel with her twin daughters, standing before the fireplace in pearls and pastel knits. And then there was Eleanor. In most photos, she was either in the background or alone, holding a book or walking one of the estate's golden retrievers through a field. A quiet presence in a family built on loud impressions. It wasn't that. Eleanor lacked beauty. In fact, many would say she was striking. Tall and willowy, with auburn hair she never dyed and pale green eyes that watched everything carefully. She had a stillness about her that unnerved some people and enchanted others. But she didn't flirt, didn't host, didn't network. She wasn't like her sisters. While they thrived in cocktail parties and garden tours, Eleanor preferred solitude. She read Russian literature in the attic, helped the stable hands with foaling, and spent hours wandering the woods beyond the family pond. To her family, she was a mystery they had long stopped trying to solve. "She's too picky," Aunt Margaret would mutter at Sunday dinners, cutting into her roast with sharp precision. All those young men she grew up with, and not one of them suited her? "She needs to soften up," Isabel chimed in once, adjusting her diamond bracelet. "Men don't like being analyzed. They like to feel adored. She's just shy," her grandmother Evelyn offered on occasion, the only one who seemed to speak without a hidden jab. "And smart, maybe smarter than all of us." But smart wasn't what the Hawthornes valued most in a woman. Poise, grace, a good match. These were the family currencies. And in those, Eleanor had failed. Each year, the pressure mounted. Family, friends, and acquaintances offered setups. Always awkward affairs that left Eleanor feeling like livestock at auction. Local heirs, sons of ranchers, aspiring mayors. None of them seemed to see her, really see her. They spoke of horses and investments and family names, but their eyes never lingered on her thoughts. Only on her face, her dowry, and the reputation she carried. And with each declined match, the whispers grew louder. "She'll die alone. She's already set in her ways. No man wants to marry a woman with opinions that strong." By the time she turned 29, the assumption had solidified. Eleanor Hawthorne would never marry. The house was unusually quiet one early April morning, dew still clinging to the porch railing, and the scent of honeysuckle drifting through the air. Eleanor stood barefoot in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea while watching the fog roll off the fields. The old grandfather clock ticked methodically in the hallway behind her, a familiar rhythm in a life that never quite changed. "You've got dirt on your hem again," Catherine said, breezing into the room in a silk robe, eyes still half closed. "Were you out in the stables?" Eleanor looked down at her long linen skirt, smudged at the bottom. "I was helping Jonah with the new colt. It was having trouble standing." Catherine sighed, as if that was the most hopeless thing she'd ever heard. "You're never going to meet someone if you keep dressing like a governess from a Bronte novel." "I'm not trying to meet anyone," Eleanor replied calmly. "Exactly." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension as natural between them as breath. "You know," Catherine added, flipping through her phone, "there's a wedding next month. The Gray's youngest daughter. You should come. There'll be eligible men. That lawyer from Charleston might be there." "I'd rather be with the horses, and that's why people talk, Eleanor." That sentence lingered long after Catherine had left the room. Later that day, Eleanor wandered through the orchard behind the house. The apple trees were just beginning to bloom, pale pink buds promising fruit in the coming months. She loved this part of the land, quieter, more forgotten. A small bench sat beneath the oldest tree, its bark deeply grooved, like an elder telling stories no one else remembered. She sat there often, journal in her lap, listening to the sounds of birds, the creak of branches, the rustle of wind through grass. It was here she felt most like herself, not the Hawthorne daughter, not the object of family scrutiny, but simply Eleanor, the girl who had once dreamed of being a writer, the woman who still wrote secretly, late at night, crafting characters who lived daring, romantic lives she never allowed herself to imagine. Sometimes she wondered if something was wrong with her, why the idea of a grand wedding and a powerful husband didn't excite her the way it did her sisters, why she didn't want a man to complete her, only someone who might understand her. Was that too much to ask? The truth was, Eleanor had loved once, quietly, painfully. Years ago, when she was 23, a stable hand named Caleb had worked the summer with the horses. He was kind, with laughing eyes and rough hands that treated animals with more tenderness than most men treated women. They'd exchanged books, glances, stolen words between chores. Nothing ever happened, not really. But one night he'd almost kissed her by the pond. Almost. Then he was gone, fired quietly after her father found out. She never saw him again, and after that she stopped looking. Love, it seemed, wasn't for girls like her. That night, as the family gathered in the formal dining room for another elaborately choreographed meal, Eleanor took her usual place at the far end of the table. Conversations flitted around her. Isabel's fundraising dinner, Catherine's new interior decorator, their father's plans to expand the vineyard. No one asked her how her day had been. She didn't mind, until her grandmother cleared her throat and tapped her spoon gently on the edge of her plate. "Eleanor," she said, voice clear despite her age. "How old are you now, darling?" The room quieted. Eleanor smiled faintly, knowing exactly where this was headed. 29, grandmother. My, almost 30. In my day, we were mothers. Of 3 by then. In your day, women also couldn't vote, Eleanor said softly. Catherine choked on her wine. Their father frowned. Grandmother Evelyn only laughed. True enough. Still, it's not too late. There's a young doctor I met at church. You should meet him. She's not interested, Isabel said quickly. Not in any man, apparently. The words weren't cruel, not entirely. Just resigned, like they'd already given up. Eleanor excused herself before dessert. In the hallway, she paused before one of the family portraits. It showed the whole Hawthorne clan, taken 10 years ago. Everyone dressed in pastels, standing before the rose garden. Eleanor stood in the back row, hands clasped, smiling softly but distantly, as though she knew she didn't belong in the picture. That night, in her room, she opened her journal. They say I'll never marry. They think I'm broken, too proud, too strange. But maybe I'm just waiting for something real, something more than a last name and a diamond ring. Maybe I don't want to be saved. Maybe I want to be seen. She paused, then added, one day, they'll ask for a seat at my wedding. I wonder if I'll let them in. It was a Thursday evening when Eleanor returned from the town's small library, with a stack of weathered books in her arms and a headache behind her eyes. The early spring sun had just begun to set behind the distant hills, casting long golden shadows across the front lawn of the Hawthorne estate. The gravel crackled under her boots as she made her way from the truck to the porch, her thoughts still lingering on the poetry she had just discovered in a forgotten volume buried in the library's archives. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The house was unusually quiet, but not in the peaceful way Eleanor liked. It was the sort of silence that hung in the air just before a storm broke, sharp, expectant, unnatural. From the front foyer, she could hear muffled voices coming from the dining room, and she immediately regretted not staying out in the orchard for another hour. She placed the books carefully on the console table near the staircase and smoothed her skirt before entering. The dining room, as always, was impeccably arranged. Ivory candles flickered in silver holders. The long mahogany table was set with bone-white china rimmed in gold, and the scent of roast chicken and rosemary floated gently through the air. Her mother, Eleanor, Sr., sat at the head of the table, posture perfect, pearls at her throat. Across from her, their father sipped a glass of red wine while flipping through a newspaper. Catherine and Isabel were already seated, engaged in a hushed conversation that ended the moment Eleanor appeared. "There you are," said her mother with a smile so poised it felt rehearsed. "We were beginning to think you wouldn't make it." "I didn't realize there was a specific time," Eleanor replied, pulling out her chair. "I thought this was a casual dinner." "In this house," her mother said, "dinners are never casual." She offered no further explanation. As the staff brought in the food, Eleanor could feel the weight of eyes on her, observing, assessing. She unfolded her napkin and placed it on her lap, careful not to meet anyone's gaze. "How was the library?" her father asked, the question sounding more like a test than polite curiosity. "Quiet," she replied. "I found a collection of Edna St. Vincent Millay's early work. Some of it isn't archived anywhere else." "Is that the one who died young and scandalously?" Catherine asked, arching a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Possibly," Eleanor said. "Or perhaps she just lived honestly." A beat of silence passed. "I don't understand why you spend so much time with books," Isabel said, swirling her wine glass. "There's life to be lived out there, Ellie. People to meet, events to attend. You can't marry a novel." Eleanor smiled politely. "I'm not looking to marry anything." "That," said their father, folding his newspaper, "is precisely the concern." The conversation that followed unraveled slowly, like a silk ribbon pulled thread by thread. It was never loud or confrontational. The Hawthornes didn't argue. They disapproved with elegance. They made their points with raised eyebrows, strategically placed sighs, and carefully worded sentences designed to wound without ever breaking decorum. "We've all had to make compromises," her mother said at one point, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Marriage isn't about passion or poetry. It's about building something, stability, future." "Speak for yourself," Isabel said with a smirk. "My marriage is full of passion. Just ask Gregory." Catherine laughed, but Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate. "And yet," her mother continued, "you insist on waiting for something that doesn't exist. You're not a girl anymore, Eleanor. You're almost 30, and with each year, the chances narrow. A woman's prime is—" "Don't," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Don't finish that sentence." The table fell silent. Her father cleared his throat, reaching for the wine. "We only want what's best for you." "No," she said this time quietly. "You want what's most comfortable for you." The silence deepened. Her grandmother Evelyn, who had been listening quietly while pushing peas around her plate, finally spoke. "I think Eleanor's doing just fine," she said. "Better a sharp mind and solitude than an empty heart and a pretty ring." Eleanor's gaze snapped to her grandmother, startled by the unexpected support. Evelyn met her eyes and gave a small, knowing nod. "Well," her mother sniffed, clearly displeased. "That's a romantic notion, but not very practical. Eleanor needs to consider her future before she becomes a burden." Eleanor asked. "An embarrassment? An example?" No one responded. She pushed back her chair and stood slowly. "Excuse me," she said. "I suddenly lost my appetite." She walked out of the house and into the darkening evening, cool air hitting her face like a cleansing balm. Her boots sank slightly into the damp earth as she headed toward the paddocks. The stars were beginning to peek through the deepening indigo sky, and the moon hung low and wide above the fields. There, in the stillness of the barn, she found peace. The horses stirred softly in their stalls, and she moved among them with ease, her fingers brushing their manes, her breath slowing. She paused beside her favorite, a chestnut mare named Juniper, and leaned her forehead against the smooth curve of her neck. "They think I'm broken," she whispered. "But I'm just not made for their world." Juniper snorted softly as if in agreement. The next morning, Eleanor found herself the subject of even more whispers. In the kitchen, two maids paused their conversation when she entered. In the garden, the landscaper gave her a long look before returning to his hedge trimming. Even the cook seemed to hesitate before offering her usual good morning coffee. Something was spreading, a quiet ripple. She didn't need to ask what it was. That evening, a cousin called, Rosalie, from Savannah. She was getting married in September. The invitation had arrived that morning. Eleanor hadn't received one. She hung up the phone without saying anything. By Sunday, the whispers had a voice. During brunch, which the family insisted on having, weekly, with all the pomp and formality of a royal affair, Catherine made an announcement. "Gregory and I are renewing our vows this summer. We've decided to do it here at Hawthorne. The gardens will be in full bloom by then." "Oh, how lovely," their mother said. "We'll invite the whole town. It will be the event of the season. And of course," Catherine continued, smiling at Eleanor, "we'll be highlighting all the strong marriages in the family. You know, a celebration of love and legacy." Eleanor raised her teacup slowly. "So I'll be seated with the widows and the divorced?" Laughter rippled around the table. Not warm, not cruel, just amused, dismissive. "They didn't mean it that way," her father said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Don't be so sensitive." But Eleanor wasn't being sensitive. She was being pushed, slowly. deliberately. Each gathering, each comment, each whisper was a reminder. She was not living up to their expectations, not fulfilling her role, not becoming what they needed her to be. But for the first time, instead of shrinking under the weight of that judgment, she felt something else stirring. Resolve, not bitterness, not rebellion. Resolve. Later that week, she returned to the orchard. This time, she brought her journal and a small tin of paints she hadn't used in years. She sat beneath the old tree and began to paint the orchard, not as it looked, but as she felt it. Swirls of gold and blue, shadows and blooms, a portrait of her inner world. As she painted, she wrote, "They want me to be small, predictable, grateful, but I am a woman who feels the earth, who speaks to animals, who dreams in colors they've never seen. I don't want what they want. I don't need their tables or their gowns or their glances of approval. But one day, they'll see." Eleanor didn't know that day would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would begin with the arrival of a man no one saw coming, not even her. It began with a call from Jonah, the stable manager. One of the colts had developed a persistent limp. He wasn't eating much, and his gait had grown unstable overnight. Jonah, a man of few words and many decades with the Hawthorne family, rarely asked for help. So when he did, it meant the matter was serious. Eleanor was in the barn by sunrise. The colt, a gray yearling named Ash, stood awkwardly in the corner of his stall, favoring his left foreleg and flicking his ears back with agitation. His eyes, usually bright and alert, looked dull and uncertain. Eleanor approached slowly, whispering calming words, gently pressing her hand to his neck. "We need a vet," she murmured, looking to Jonah, who stood nearby with his arms folded. He nodded. "Already made the call, but Dr. Whitmore's out of town for that conference. Said he sent someone in his place. A new guy. From the city, I think." Eleanor blinked. "City?" Jonah shrugged. "Charleston, maybe?" He didn't say much, just that he'd be here before 10. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Vets didn't often come to Hawthorne Farm without prior vetting. Dr. Whitmore had been the family's veterinarian for nearly 15 years, reliable if not particularly warm. The idea of someone new, someone unfamiliar, made Eleanor uneasy, not because she didn't trust outsiders, but because the Hawthornes were not known for welcoming them. At precisely 9:43 a.m., a dust trail curled down the long gravel driveway. From the porch of the barn, Eleanor watched as a silver truck pulled up. Not the dusty, dented kind most local vets drove, but a sleek, well-maintained vehicle with polished hubcaps and dark-tinted windows. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who did not, by any stretch of the imagination, resemble the typical country veterinarian. He was tall, lean, and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple gray Henley rolled at the sleeves, dark jeans, and boots that looked like they'd seen enough dirt to earn credibility. His jawline was sharp, shadowed with dark stubble, and his thick, slightly messy hair caught the morning light. He looked like someone from a movie about men who leave law firms to become ranchers, except he was real, and walking straight toward her. "Good morning," he said, removing his sunglasses with a smooth motion and revealing eyes the color of old whiskey. "I'm Dr. Thomas Callahan, here to see a lame colt?" Eleanor stared for a second longer than she meant to. Then she blinked. "Yes, this way." Inside the barn, Thomas moved with ease and quiet confidence. He didn't speak unnecessarily, nor did he put on airs of superiority, a rarity among the professionals who often dealt with Hawthorne money. Instead, he crouched beside the colt, speaking softly, examining the leg with careful precision, his brow furrowed in thought. "Joint inflammation," he said eventually. "Probably early-stage epiphysitis. Not uncommon in growing colts, especially on a high-protein diet. Nothing irreversible, but we need to ease the pressure. I'd recommend stall rest and switching his feed." He stood brushing hay from his knees. Eleanor, who had been watching him the entire time, nodded slowly. "You sound certain." "I've seen it before," he replied. "Worked a year on a stud farm in Kentucky during residency. High-performance lines just like this one." She tilted her head. "You don't sound local." "I'm not. Charleston. Originally, yes. Spent the last few years moving between clinics. Some rural, some urban. Just opened my own. Practice down by Green Hollow." "Green Hollow?" Jonah asked, skeptical. "That's 30 minutes from here. We haven't had a clinic out that way in years. I'm changing that." After the exam, Eleanor walked him back to the truck. She didn't know why. Politeness, maybe. Or curiosity. "I appreciate how you handled him," she said as they reached the gravel path. "Ash, I mean, he's a good colt. Strong, but skittish. He trusts you." Thomas replied, glancing at her. That says a lot. She wasn't used to compliments, at least not ones like that, not ones that saw past the surface. You'll be staying in the area then? She asked. He nodded. For a while, yes. I'm not a big fan of cities. Too much noise, not enough truth. That made her smile, just faintly. You'll find plenty of quiet here, she said. I already have. For a moment, their eyes locked. Then Jonah cleared his throat loudly from the barn entrance. Thomas looked away, smirking. Well, until next time, Miss Hawthorne. Eleanor, she said. He nodded. Eleanor. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, replaying their conversation. She didn't even try to stop herself. There was something in the way he'd looked at her. Not like a Hawthorne, not like a woman to impress, but as if he actually wanted to know her. She didn't tell anyone he'd called later that evening to check on the colt, and she certainly didn't mention that his voice on the phone had made her stomach flutter in ways no carefully selected suitor ever had. Over the following weeks, Thomas returned to the farm more than once. Each time, under the guise of professional concern, checking on Ash's progress, administering follow-up treatment, adjusting his diet. But it was more than that. Eleanor knew it, felt it, and she didn't resist. They began to speak more openly, not just about horses, but books, music, small-town gossip. He asked about her favorite authors. She asked about his life before Green Hollow. Why veterinary medicine? She asked one afternoon as they sat on the fence, watching the horses graze. My mother, he said. She ran a rescue shelter out near the coast. I grew up around broken things, animals mostly. She taught me how to fix what could be saved and to let go of what couldn't. Eleanor nodded. That sounds hard. It was, he admitted, but it taught me how to listen. Really listen. She didn't reply, just looked out at the pasture. Then he added, most people don't listen to you, do they? She turned to him surprised. They talk at you, he said. Or around you, not to you. She swallowed. Yes. He smiled gently. I noticed. Back in the house, her sisters began to notice something too. You've been glowing lately, Isabel said one morning. What's his name? Eleanor didn't answer. Catherine, more direct, cornered her in the upstairs hall. You've been smiling too much for someone who still insists she'll never marry. Eleanor arched a brow. Maybe I just stopped, needing approval to be happy. Catherine scoffed. You're hiding something. Not everything needs to be public, Catherine. That's not very Hawthorne of you. Good. It wasn't long before the whispers changed tone. From pity to suspicion, people saw her talking to Thomas at the farmer's market. They noticed how he always parked on the far side of the stables when he came, how she lingered in the barn after he left. One afternoon, her father summoned her to his study. I've heard rumors, he said, about you and this veterinarian. They're not rumors if they're true. He stared at her clearly, unprepared for her honesty. You're a Hawthorne, he said. You don't entangle yourself with men like that. I entangle myself with people who see me, she replied. That should have been enough for you. She walked out before he could answer. Eleanor knew it wasn't love yet, but it was something more than anything she'd known before. Something quiet and real and growing. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of where it might lead. The barn had always been a sanctuary for Eleanor. Long before Thomas Callahan arrived at Hawthorne Farm, the scent of hay and cedar wood, the soft shuffling of hooves, and the gentle sighs of horses had offered her a kind of solace that no drawing room or parlor ever could. Here, no one judged. Her silence. Here, her solitude was not weakness. It was peace. But now, the barn held something else too. A secret. It began innocently. Thomas continued checking on Ash, the gray colt, as promised. Each visit stretched a bit longer. A few more minutes talking. A few more observations that turned into questions, then into stories. He had a way of drawing her out without pressing, like water slowly coaxing a bud to open. On the third visit in a week, he brought coffee. I figured you're a black no sugar kind of woman, he said, handing her the thermos as they leaned against the paddock railing. Eleanor smirked. And what makes you think that? You don't strike me as someone who needs sweetness added to be interesting. She blinked. Her face warmed, but she hid it behind a sip. It was perfect. By the second week, the conversations had deepened. Eleanor found herself looking forward to his truck's approach, that flash of silver in the distance, the sound of boots on gravel, the way his voice filled the air like an old song she'd never realized she missed. They began meeting at dusk, when the sun melted into the trees. and the sky went pale blue and gold. At first it was always around the horses, but eventually Thomas started staying after the checkups were done, lingering long after Jonah had gone home and the barn was quiet. They sat on bales of hay, shared stories, argued about books and music, and sometimes just sat in silence, that rare kind of silence between two people who didn't need to fill space to be heard. "I used to think," Eleanor said one evening, running her fingers along the coarse edge of a wooden beam, "that I wasn't made for this world." Thomas didn't interrupt. She continued, voice low, "Not the world in here, the one with chandeliers and ribboned gowns and dinner parties where you smile so much your face aches. I always felt misplaced." "You weren't misplaced," Thomas said. "You were misread." That stopped her. "Misread?" He nodded, resting his forearms on his knees. "People think silence is emptiness, but you're full of things, thoughts, fire. They just never took the time to see." No one had ever said that to her. Not once in 29 years. She couldn't look at him. So she looked at the horses instead, blinking faster than usual. Of course, it didn't take long for people to notice. Hawthorne's staff had always been discreet, trained to speak only when spoken to, and never about matters that involved Miss Eleanor. But even they couldn't ignore the quiet tension, the extra time Thomas spent at the barn, the way Eleanor began dressing just slightly differently on the days he was expected. Softer hair, a little color on her lips, nothing overt, but enough for those who watched to understand. Catherine was the first to say it aloud. At brunch, "Someone's been glowing again," she said, passing the butter. "Let me guess. The charming veterinarian with the soulful eyes." Their mother stiffened. "I've heard talk," she said coolly, "about how often he visits. He's good with the horses," Eleanor replied simply. "And the daughter of the house, it seems," Isabel added, raising an eyebrow. Eleanor stood, pushing her chair back. "Maybe I enjoy talking to someone who doesn't treat me like a burden." There was a beat of stunned silence. Her grandmother Evelyn once again was the only one who smiled. That evening, Eleanor didn't wait for Thomas to arrive. She went to him. She took the old path behind the orchard that led to the back of the property, and beyond it, the small dirt road toward Green Hollow, where he had just opened his practice. She found him in the clinic's stables, brushing down a bay gelding with rhythmic strokes. "You came," he said, not surprised. "I needed air," she answered. They stood facing each other across the stall. The light was dim, the scent of leather and cedar thick in the air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she stepped forward. "I want to know if this is real," she said, "because I'm risking more than you realize." Thomas's expression softened. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It's real," he said, "but I won't ask for anything you're not ready to give." She nodded, heart thudding, and for the first time she let herself imagine what might come next. From that night on, they met more often, always in secret. They walked together beneath the moonlight in the outer fields, shared coffee on foggy mornings behind the barn, passed notes in books when they couldn't speak openly. It was thrilling and terrifying, like living in a novel where the heroine finally found the plot twist that made the pages worth turning. But reality, as always, lurked close behind. One afternoon, as Eleanor returned from town, she found her mother waiting in the drawing room. She was holding a folded slip of paper, one Eleanor recognized immediately, a note from Thomas. "Eleanor, come by after sundown. The clinic's quiet then. I'll leave the lantern lit. Tea." Her mother's face was unreadable. "I asked the staff to turn out your laundry," she said calmly. "This was in the pocket of your coat." Eleanor stood very still. "Do you have something to say?" her mother asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I care about him. That man is not your equal. He's not trying to be," Eleanor said, voice rising. "He doesn't want my money. He wants me." Her mother narrowed her eyes. "You are a Hawthorne. That name carries weight." Eleanor stepped closer. "Then let it carry me somewhere I choose." She went to Thomas that night anyway, told him everything. He listened, eyes dark, jaw tense. "I can leave," he said, "if this causes you pain." "No," she interrupted. "Not again." He tilted his head. "Again?" She hesitated, then told him about Caleb, the boy who once almost kissed her, the one her family erased. Thomas's jaw clenched. "You deserved better." "I want better now," she said, and for the first time he kissed her. It was quiet and certain, like the promise of something long overdue. From that night on, everything changed. They were no longer pretending. No longer hiding behind polite distance, they were falling in love, quietly, stubbornly, and against everything her family believed in. But Eleanor knew the storm was coming, because Hawthornes didn't like to lose control, and someone, somewhere, was already whispering. And this time, it would not stay in the barn. The news reached the drawing room before Eleanor did. By the time she stepped through the French doors that opened onto the main parlor, the atmosphere inside the Hawthorne house had already shifted. The air was too still, the scent of polished wood and lilacs too sharp. Her mother was waiting, seated perfectly upright on the edge of the velvet sofa, hands folded on her lap like she had rehearsed this confrontation a dozen times. And perhaps she had. "Sit," Eleanor Sr. said without looking up from her teacup. Eleanor hesitated, then crossed the room and sat across from her, not like a daughter coming home, but like a witness about to testify. Her mother finally looked up. "Do you think I don't know what's happening?" Eleanor blinked. "That depends. Are we talking about the horses, the garden renovation, or the fact that I'm seeing Thomas Callahan?" Her mother's nostrils flared, but her tone remained icy. "So it's true." "Yes," Eleanor said calmly. "It's true." Her mother placed the teacup down with such precision it barely made a sound. "You're making a mistake." Eleanor didn't respond. "You're risking everything," her mother continued. "Your reputation, this family's legacy. What do you think people will say when they find out the last Hawthorne daughter is courting a veterinarian from nowhere?" "I think," Eleanor said, "they'll say I finally found someone who sees me. That is not enough." Her mother snapped. The silence that followed was louder than her raised voice. Eleanor stared at her. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, "You're not angry because I'm happy. You're angry because I didn't ask permission." Her mother's mouth twitched, a subtle, involuntary tell. Eleanor leaned forward. "You wanted me to be small, manageable. I played along for years, hoping I'd earn peace. But I'm not doing that anymore. He's not your equal." "No," Eleanor said softly. "He's better than anyone you ever tried to match me with, because he's kind, because he listens, because he doesn't ask me to be anyone but myself." Her mother stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the lawn like the answer might be hidden in the hedges. "Do you love him?" she asked. Eleanor didn't flinch. "Yes." Silence stretched. Her mother turned back around, voice sharper now. "Then understand this. If you continue this relationship, you do it outside this house. The Hawthorne name does not bend for anyone, not even you." Eleanor stood slowly. "Then maybe it's time I stop carrying the name like a shackle." She walked out without another word. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, her father summoned her to his study. He didn't shout. He didn't scold. Instead, he did something far more insidious. He made her sit in silence while he reviewed estate papers, as if her presence alone was an inconvenience. Eventually, he said, without looking up, "You'll do what's right. You always have." Eleanor stood. "No, I always did what I was told. That ends now." He didn't stop her as she left. Her sisters called later that evening, Catherine first, her tone both alarmed and theatrical. "Eleanor, you can't be serious. You're throwing everything away. And for what? A man who wears denim to dinner?" Isabel followed. "We all have our fantasies, but we don't act on them." "Do you know what people are saying already? That you've gone wild, that you're desperate." Eleanor almost laughed. Desperate? For years they pitied her loneliness. Now that she had something real, they called it reckless. She didn't answer, either of them. Instead, she walked to the barn. Thomas was waiting. She found him brushing Juniper's mane in the fading twilight. His sleeves rolled, hair tousled from the wind. He looked up when he saw her, reading everything in her face. "They know," she said. He nodded once. And they want me to end it, to choose them, their version of a life." Thomas set the brush down and stepped toward her. "What do you want?" She didn't hesitate. "You." He looked at her for a long time, then said, "Then come with me." Her breath caught. "Not far," he added quickly. "Just for a few days. Leave the estate, the whispers, the rules. Come to Green Hollow. Let's see what this looks like without shadows." Eleanor stared at him. Everything inside her said yes. So she did. She left the next morning before dawn, with nothing but a bag, her journals, and the dress she'd worn the night he first kissed her. She left a note on her pillow. "I'm not running away. I'm running toward something. Maybe. For once. That's enough." Green Hollow was nothing like the Hawthorne estate. It was quieter, earthier. The roads were uneven, the trees wild and overgrown. The little cottage behind Thomas's clinic was cozy and sunlit, with books stacked haphazardly on every surface and a window that overlooked a field of violets. Eleanor felt like she could breathe again. They spent the days walking the trails, near the river, cooking together in the tiny kitchen, reading aloud from battered paperbacks in the evenings. Thomas never asked her to change. He simply made space for her to be. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel wrong. She felt chosen. On the fourth night, they sat on the porch watching the fireflies. Thomas turned to her, expression soft but serious. "I know it's early," he said, "but I want a life with you." Eleanor's heart thudded. "You don't need to answer yet," he added. "Just know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She nodded. She didn't say yes. Not yet. But she also didn't say no. Back at Hawthorne Farm, the story had already spread. Eleanor Hawthorne ran off with the veterinarian. They said, "She's having a breakdown." She always was unstable. But the whispers weren't just cruel. They were also curious. Because for the first time, Eleanor wasn't a footnote in family conversations. She was the headline. Her mother called after a week. "I hope you're enjoying your rebellion," she said. "It's not a rebellion," Eleanor replied. "It's a beginning. You'll regret this." "No, you'll regret never letting me be happy." And then she hung up. Eleanor knew it couldn't stay like this forever. She'd have to return, face them, choose, not between love and family, but between the version of herself they accepted and the one she was becoming. But she also knew something else now. She didn't need their approval, not anymore. Because sometimes, judgment is the price of freedom, and Eleanor was finally free. The wind shifted the moment Eleanor stepped back onto the estate. It wasn't just the crisp bite of late spring in the air, or the scent of freshly cut grass drifting across the property. It was something deeper, an atmospheric pressure in the form of narrowed eyes, stilled conversations, and carefully arranged smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes of those who wore them. She had been gone for 12 days. 12 days without the rigid schedules, the watchful staff, the echoing halls of Hawthorne tradition. 12 days of coffee in mismatched mugs, of Thomas's quiet laughter as he read to her under a blanket, of the gentle calm of a life with no expectations but authenticity. And now, she was home, or rather, back where she was born. Jonah met her, near the stable entrance, his weathered face unreadable. "Everything's still here," he said softly, though not everyone's been thrilled about that. She gave a small nod. "Did you hear them talking?" Jonah snorted. "You know how this place is, Miss Eleanor. If the curtains don't twitch, the tongues will." She smiled faintly. "It's good to see you." He tipped his hat and disappeared back into the stalls, a quiet ally, as always. Inside the main house, the energy was very different. Her father barely acknowledged her return. He stayed in his study most of the day, the door firmly shut, his staff relaying short, formal messages on his behalf. Catherine arrived that evening, her arms full of shopping bags and her tone as sharp as her stilettos. "I came to see if the prodigal daughter had returned looking for forgiveness," she said as she set down her things. "Or if you just ran out of canned coffee and flannel sheets." Eleanor didn't rise to the bait. "I came back to pack some of my things." "You're leaving again? For good?" Catherine's expression faltered. "Wait, you're moving in with him?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Why does that surprise you?" "Because you're a Hawthorne. This is your home." "No, Catherine. This was always your home. Isabel's. Even Mother's. I just happened to be born here." Her sister crossed her arms. "You're giving all of this up? For a man?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not for him. For me." Later that night, she stood in her old bedroom surrounded by the ghosts of her upbringing. The delicate floral wallpaper, the four-poster bed, the carefully framed diplomas from private schools she never asked to attend. It felt like a museum to a version of herself that never truly existed. She opened her closet and began folding clothes into a suitcase. Silk blouses she never wore, heels that pinched, jewelry she didn't recognize as her own. She was halfway through her wardrobe when she found the old journal tucked behind a stack of cashmere scarves, the one she started at 16, with pages full of thoughts she was too afraid to speak. She opened it to a random page. "I wonder what would happen if I just walked out, if I stopped pretending to be their version of me and became my own. Would they notice? Would they care? Or would they just replace me with another frame on the wall?" She closed the book gently and set it in her bag. The next morning, her mother summoned her. This time they met in the sunroom, a space filled with light but always cold, as though even the sunlight feared her mother's presence. Eleanor sat across from her, waiting. "You really intend to leave?" her mother said, not as a question, but as a declaration. "Yes." "Without your inheritance?" Eleanor blinked. "You're cutting me off?" Her mother sipped her tea. "You made your choice. You chose a man with no pedigree, no wealth, no influence. There are consequences." "I see," Eleanor said quietly. "So love has a price, and it's the name I carry." Her mother's voice softened, but not with kindness, with control. "You could stay. You could still fix this. End it now and return to the life you were meant to have." Eleanor tilted her head. "The life you meant for me, not the one I chose." Her mother's jaw tightened. "You're throwing away everything we built." "No," Eleanor said. "I'm walking away from something that was never mine." She stood, straightening her shoulders. "You wanted an heiress," she said, "but I was born a free woman. You just never gave me the space to be one." Then, for the first time in her life, Eleanor turned her back on her mother without waiting for permission to leave. She left the house that afternoon with 2 suitcases, her dog-eared books, a photo of her grandmother, and the keys to Thomas's truck. He had parked down by the orchard to avoid the staff's gaze. As she approached, he stepped out, sunglasses hooked on the collar of his shirt, hands in his pockets. "You sure?" he asked gently. She nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." He took her bags, loaded them into the truck, and opened the passenger door. As she climbed in, she looked one last time at the house. White pillars, perfect lawn, windows, reflecting the world like mirrors, too proud to see what they truly held. And then she let it go. The drive back to Green Hollow was quiet, not heavy, just still. When they arrived, the little cottage smelled like rosemary and warm wood. Eleanor dropped her bag by the door and exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Thomas lit a fire while she unpacked her books into his shelves. By the time the stars appeared, she was barefoot on the porch with a glass of wine in one hand and his fingers laced in hers. "You left everything," he said softly. "No," she replied. "I left nothing. I took everything that mattered with me." He smiled. "You're remarkable." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm just finally being myself." In the weeks that followed, she began to build a life. She helped at the clinic, not officially, but often. She organized files, brought lunch, spoke gently to the animals that came through the doors. She learned the names of the neighbors, visited the farmer's market without a driver, and even joined the local book club, shocking herself with how much she enjoyed the unpolished, unfiltered company of women who didn't care who her family was. Her writing returned too, not the polished, practiced prose she had once hidden, but raw pages filled with thoughts and dreams and characters that finally made sense. She wasn't Eleanor Hawthorne anymore. She was just Eleanor, and that was more than enough. One evening, Thomas returned late from a call in a nearby town. She had fallen asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her journal still open in her lap. He knelt beside her, brushed a kiss across her temple, and whispered, "I have something to ask you." She stirred, blinking. "I know the world hasn't made this easy," he said. "I know you've lost things to be here, but I also know what we have is real. So, will you marry me?" She stared at him. No ring, no speech, no spectacle, just truth. And that was all she ever needed. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, "Yes." Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "I gave up a legacy, but I gained a future. I was born an heiress, but I chose to be free." The town of Green Hollow had never seen anything quite like Eleanor Hawthorne. She wasn't loud or showy, nor did she dress in a way that drew attention. But there was something unmistakably different about her. The way she carried herself with quiet confidence, the way she listened more than she spoke, and the way her presence seemed to anchor a room rather than dominate it. People noticed. And in a town where people noticed everything, that mattered. It wasn't long before the whispers shifted from curiosity to admiration. "She's not like the other Hawthorns. She's actually kind." I heard she gave up everything for love. The last one made Eleanor smile whenever she heard it. Not because it was entirely true, but because it was close enough. What she had given up was not just wealth or a name. It was the weight of other people's definitions. And in return, she had found a life that finally made sense. Thomas's clinic thrived in those first few months. Word spread quickly that Dr. Callahan wasn't just competent. He was attentive, gentle, and above all, honest. He didn't overcharge the elderly couple who brought in their arthritic dachshund. He didn't scoff at the local teenager who arrived with a barn cat wrapped in a flannel shirt. He treated everyone with the same calm sincerity that had drawn Eleanor in from the beginning. And she was more than just the woman behind the counter. She was becoming part of the foundation, helping organize patient records, creating a proper filing system, even designing a new logo for the clinic sign. Her creative instincts, long buried under social expectations, had found fertile ground. One afternoon, as she was painting a new signboard to hang by the road, Thomas came out with 2 cups of lemonade and a grin. "You know," he said, handing her a drink, "when I imagined this life, I always thought I'd be alone." She looked up from the brush. "Is that how you planned it?" He shrugged. "Not planned, expected. I always thought I was too restless to stay and too honest to settle. But then you appeared." She smiled, dipping the brush again. "Maybe we found each other because we both stopped pretending." He nodded. "That's a good start." Then he added, "But what if we made it more?" She tilted her head. "More?" He sat beside her on the porch steps. "I've been thinking about your writing, about your ideas. What if we expanded the clinic?" Her eyebrows rose. "Expanded? Into a community space," he explained. "Not just animals, workshops, creative retreats, a place where people come to heal, in more ways than one." Eleanor's heart skipped. "You'd do that?" "With you," he said. "Only with you." That night, they sat by the fire with their notebooks open, brainstorming, sketching ideas. Eleanor scribbled pages of thoughts about how creativity was a form of healing, how storytelling could reconnect people to themselves, and how nature offered more therapy than any padded room ever could. They mapped out phases: a garden for outdoor reading, a converted barn space for group events, weekend workshops with local artists, therapy animals for children with trauma, even a quarterly creativity camp for teens who had no outlet in town. They called it the Hollow Project, and just like that, their love became a plan. Weeks later, a formal announcement appeared in the local paper, "Coming soon to Green Hollow, a new kind of community space, where stories begin and healing happens, founded by Eleanor Hawthorne and Dr. Thomas Callahan." Of course, it didn't go unnoticed. Within a week, Eleanor received a card in elegant handwriting with her mother's initials embossed in gold. "We need to speak. Your father and I will be home Thursday afternoon. E. Hawthorne." Eleanor stared at it for a long time before folding it and placing it in a drawer. Thomas looked at her carefully. "You going?" She sighed. "I think I have to." She returned to the Hawthorne estate on a gray Thursday. Everything looked the same, too the same. The lawn was perfect, the windows too clean, the air too still. It felt like walking back into a perfectly preserved photograph. Her mother met her in the music room, seated beside the grand piano she never played. Her father stood by the fireplace, hands behind his back, expression unreadable. "Congratulations," her mother said, though her tone didn't match the word. "The county is buzzing about your project," her father added, "and your engagement." Eleanor raised her chin. "I didn't come for approval." "Good," her mother said coolly, "because you won't get it." Eleanor waited. "You're turning your back on your family," her father continued, "on generations of tradition. For what? A barn with paint and poetry? For a life I chose," she said. "One that's mine." Her mother sighed, standing. "And what happens when it fails? When he leaves? When the novelty fades?" Eleanor stepped forward. "Then I'll still have my freedom, and that's more than I ever had here." They stared at her in silence. Then, just as she turned to go, her father said quietly, "The invitations have begun to arrive." She paused. "The Grays, the Holloways, the Whitfields, all asking if you'll be attending their events. Not as a guest, as an inspiration." Her mother added bitterly, "You've become a symbol, Eleanor. The Hawthorne girl who gave it all up and somehow didn't fall apart." Eleanor turned fully. "Maybe that's because I was never theirs to begin with." She left without looking back. Back in Green Hollow, she threw herself into the project. Every day brought something new. Salvaged wood deliveries, hand-painted signs, letters from young writers asking to join the first workshop. Eleanor worked with a kind of joy that felt cellular, as if her body had been waiting her whole life to do this. She and Thomas were no longer just in love. They were in sync. They planned their wedding for autumn, under the trees. No chapel, no chandeliers, no white aisle flanked by stiff relatives and muted tones. Just wildflowers, music, and a guest list built on heart, not hierarchy. The week before the invitations went out, Eleanor received an email from Catherine. "You win. Everyone wants to know you now. We used to laugh about you, remember? Now they're asking for your story. They want to come to the wedding." She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Once, they said I'd never marry. Now they're begging for a seat at my wedding. Not because I proved them wrong, but because I proved myself right." The day Thomas proposed again was one of those rare afternoons that felt entirely suspended in time, as if nature itself had paused, just to make sure everything was perfect. Summer had settled softly over Green Hollow. The days were long, the air golden and fragrant. Wildflowers lined the dirt paths that led out of town, and the fields behind Thomas's clinic were now blanketed in blooms, violets, soft pink clover, and endless rows of lavender that Eleanor had insisted on planting herself. What had started as a small idea, a handful of seeds pressed into soil, had become a garden of wild intention. Eleanor often came here to write. She'd bring her journal, a thermos of tea, and a blanket, and lie in the middle of the field as bees buzzed around her like tiny guardians. Sometimes she wrote pages. Sometimes she just watched the wind bend the stalks, listened to the hum of the earth. It was the place she went when she needed to remember who she was. And that afternoon, Thomas joined her. He came down the hill carrying a basket and a rolled-up blanket under one arm. She spotted him from the far end of the lavender rows, his silhouette familiar and grounding. The way he walked, casual, steady, with just enough of a smile in the corner of his mouth to melt away anything heavy, still undid her, even now. She sat up as he reached her. "I thought we could take a break," he said. "Lunch, or something." Resembling it, she laughed as he unfolded the blanket. "You brought a picnic?" "I brought cold chicken, grapes, and your favorite crackers," he said. So yes, a very sophisticated, gourmet, rural-adjacent picnic. She reached into the basket and pulled out a small wrapped cloth. "Is this cheese wrapped in wax paper?" "It's either brie or something close to expired," he admitted. She laughed, shaking her head. "You're lucky I'm already engaged to you." Thomas raised an eyebrow and sat beside her. "About that." She paused, half smiling. "About what?" He reached into his back pocket, not with the dramatic pause of a man about to perform, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had made up his mind long ago. What he pulled out wasn't a ring box, it was a folded sheet of paper. "I was going to do this at the ceremony," he said. "But then I realized we don't do things like other people. So why wait?" Ori handed her the paper. She looked at him, then slowly opened it. It was a letter. His handwriting, blocky and a little slanted, filled the page. "Eleanor, I've met a lot of people who speak in loud voices, who fill rooms with sound and expect the world to bend for them. But you don't raise your voice. You raise the temperature of a room by simply being in it. You don't chase attention. You attract gravity. You are, without question, the most honest thing I've ever known. I don't want to marry you because it will make sense to anyone else. I want to marry you because, before you, I didn't know what it meant to want to stay. So here's my second proposal, not with rings or fanfare, just a promise that I will keep showing up, that I will let you be entirely yourself every day without asking you to shrink or translate, that I will protect your dreams like they're part of me, that I will grow with you, not ahead of you or behind you, but always beside you. Say yes again. Let's build the world we dreamed about. Yours, T." When she finished reading, she was crying. He didn't ask why. He just reached over and wiped the tears with the edge of his sleeve, smiling gently. "Well?" he asked. She folded the letter and placed it against her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Always yes." They lay in the field for hours after that. The lavender swayed around them, the scent thick and comforting. The sky turned from blue to amber, and when night finally arrived, they stayed long enough to see the stars ignite across the sky. "Do you ever wonder what your younger self would think of all this?" Thomas asked as they lay side by side, their fingers intertwined. "All the time," she said. "I think she'd be stunned I even got here, that I said no to everything I was told I had to be, and survived." "You didn't just survive," he said. "You created something better." She turned her head to look at him. "And you?" He considered the question. "I think the boy I was would be shocked I ever stopped running," he said, "but even more shocked that I found someone worth staying for." They were quiet for a while after that. Sometimes the truth didn't need more than silence to settle in. The next morning, Eleanor woke before sunrise and walked to the field alone. She brought her journal. She sat cross-legged in the grass, the letter from Thomas folded inside the back pocket of her notebook, her hair still smelling faintly of lavender from the day before. She wrote, I was told marriage was a performance, a role you stepped into fitted like a dress. But this is something else entirely. This is two people building something that doesn't require applause, something that doesn't need a script. I'm not a bride because of a gown. I'm not a wife because of a name. I'm just a woman who chose, and was chosen in return. In the days that followed, the wedding preparations began in earnest, but not in the way anyone expected. There were no planners, no contracts, no color-coded seating charts. Just long walks through the property, selecting the perfect spot under a canopy of oak trees. Just handwritten invitations, ink bleeding slightly from Eleanor's fountain pen. No ballroom, no diamond-studded guest list, only wildflower arrangements gathered by local kids, a string quartet formed by neighbors, and a promise. No pretense. No permission needed. Eleanor asked her grandmother, Evelyn, to walk her down the aisle. "I don't need to be given away," she said, "but I would like to arrive with someone who always saw me." Evelyn smiled through tears. "Then I'll wear my best hat." And then the invitations went out. To friends, to the women in her writing group, to the shelter volunteers, to the kids who came for art sessions on Saturdays, and yes, to her family too. Because forgiveness, Eleanor had learned, wasn't always for them. Sometimes it was for herself, and she was ready to be free. The envelopes were cream-colored and sealed with wax, not gold or silver, but a soft lavender hue, pressed with a delicate wildflower emblem. Eleanor had spent the previous afternoon at the kitchen table of the cottage in Green Hollow, writing out each name by hand, not for extravagance or formality, but because this mattered, because the act of inviting someone into this chapter of her life was no longer a performance of status, but a sacred offering of truth. Each letter carried the same message, written in her own hand. "You are invited to celebrate the marriage of Eleanor Grace Hawthorne and Dr. Thomas Callahan under the oaks of Green Hollow, where love bloomed freely and without permission. Come as you are. Stay if you wish. Witness something real." The first batch went to friends, to the local farmers who helped till the lavender rose, to the elderly librarian who kept setting aside first editions for Eleanor, to the children who had painted paper lanterns for the reception. These were the people who had seen Eleanor become herself. The second batch went to the Hawthornes, and that was when the ground began to shift. Catherine received her envelope first. It arrived at the Eugene Country Club where she was attending a brunch fundraiser, delivered by hand with the morning mail. She opened it between sips of cucumber water, expecting an invitation to yet another society event. What she found instead made her freeze. Isabel received hers while shopping for patio furniture. She was in line at the register when she opened the envelope, and her gasp was audible enough to make the woman behind her ask, "Is everything all right?" Their mothers arrived at the Hawthorne estate, delivered with a stack of bills and catalogs. She didn't open it immediately. The handwriting caught her off guard. Something about the way Eleanor had penned her full name across the front. Something unshakably certain. When she did open it, her hand trembled. She read the words twice. Then she folded the card neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and walked to her dressing table. There, she laid it beside a porcelain jewelry box and stared at it for several minutes, saying nothing. By the end of the week, the reactions had begun to circulate. "She's really doing it." She invited everyone, even them. The Hawthorne name had always controlled the narrative. They determined who was included and who was left behind. They curated reality like a gallery. Only what was polished could be displayed. So to receive an invitation to a wedding that neither asked for their approval nor followed their rules was, in their world, a declaration of war. But it was also irresistible. The curiosity was too great. They had spent months, even years, whispering about Eleanor. Now they were being invited to see her, not as the disappointment they dismissed, but as the woman who walked away from everything and still managed to rise. The RSVPs came in slowly. Some relatives declined with polite excuses on travel commitments, schedule conflicts, prior engagements, but more than expected said yes. Even Catherine, whose initial response was to scoff and declare she would never attend such a provincial display, sent back a carefully worded acceptance. "I will be there." Out of respect, Isabel followed suit, claiming she wanted to see it for herself. Eleanor read each response with detached calm. She wasn't doing this to prove anything, not anymore. But something inside her still stirred at the idea that those who had once looked through her might now be forced to see her, fully and without filter. A week before the wedding, her father called. She didn't answer. He called again. Eventually, she picked up. "Hello, Dad." There was a pause on the other end. Then, "You really intend to go through with this?" "Yes," she said. "You could still change your mind." "I won't." More silence. Then, "Your mother and I will attend, but don't expect us to pretend this is a blessing." "I'm not asking for a blessing," Eleanor said. "Only your honesty. You've always been too proud." "No," she replied softly. "I've just never been yours to control." He didn't respond. She hung up. That night, Thomas found her on the porch, staring up at the sky. "They're coming," she said. "I know," he replied, sitting beside her. "It's strange. I'm not afraid. I thought I would be." "You've already faced the worst of them," he said. "Now they'll have to face you." She nodded, then leaned into his shoulder. "I'm ready," she whispered. And she meant it. The day before the wedding, the final preparations began. The oak grove was strung with lights, warm, soft bulbs that danced between the branches like stars descended to earth. The wildflower centerpieces were delivered by bike. A group of teenage musicians rehearsed quietly at the edge of the clearing, their notes floating on the breeze. Eleanor stood barefoot in the field where she and Thomas had once picnicked, watching the sun melt into lavender and gold. She thought of the girl she had once been, the one who stood in rooms filled with silver and silence, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen. And she smiled, because she had stopped waiting, because she had chosen herself. The morning sunlight spilled into the kitchen of the Green Hollow cottage with a warmth that belonged more to late summer than early fall. Eleanor stood barefoot near the sink, stirring honey into her tea, when Thomas entered from the porch, a folded newspaper in one hand and a strange look on his face. She raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" He held up the paper. "Apparently. We've made the front page." She blinked. "We?" "Technically me, but it's about both of us." He laid the paper on the table and smoothed it flat. The headline read, "Local Veterinarian Turns Rural Clinic into Community Haven. A Love Story Rooted in Purpose." Eleanor stared at it. Beneath the bold title was a large photo. Thomas standing in front of the lavender fields, arms crossed, the clinic in the background. She recognized the moment. It had been taken by a local photographer weeks ago, one of the students from her first storytelling workshop. He'd asked for just one picture for a school project. Apparently, it had gone further than that. Thomas sat beside her as she read. The article described his journey from Charleston to Green Hollow, his passion for animal care, and how his practice had quietly grown into something more, a place where people brought not just their pets, but their fears, their hopes, and their stories. And then it turned to Eleanor. Alongside him is Eleanor Hawthorne, whose name once echoed through the state's most exclusive circles. But it's not her family's name that defines her here. It's her presence. Together, they've built more than a clinic. They've created a space where healing happens in more ways than one. She looked up, stunned. "You didn't tell me they were writing this." "I didn't know," Thomas admitted. "The journalist came by a few times to ask about the project. I thought it was for a local profile, not the county-wide edition." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled. "They wrote about us, not as a scandal, not as gossip, as a beginning." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Because that's what we are." The newspaper spread quickly. By noon, her phone was buzzing with messages, some from Green Hollow neighbors congratulating them, others from distant relatives who hadn't spoken to her in years. Catherine sent a short text, well, seems like you've become newsworthy." Isabel followed with, "Even Mother read it." She didn't say much, just folded it neatly and placed it on her desk. Eleanor didn't reply. She didn't need to. That afternoon, a florist from 2 towns over called and offered to donate additional arrangements for the wedding. "We were inspired by what you're building," the woman said. "It's rare what you two have. We just wanted to be part of it." Later at the market, an older couple stopped her by the apples. "We read about your Thomas," the man said, tipping his cap. "Good man. And you're the kind of woman people remember." Eleanor was caught off guard, but she thanked them with a nod and a small smile. Back at the clinic, a group of teenagers from the local high school stopped by after seeing the article. They didn't bring animals, just questions. "Can we volunteer?" Eleanor exchanged a look with Thomas, and just like that, the Hollow Project gained its first youth mentors. But not everyone was impressed. That evening, a courier delivered an envelope from the Hawthorne estate, thicker than usual, with her father's seal on the back. Eleanor opened it slowly, expecting resistance. Inside was a typed note. Eleanor, we read the article. I won't pretend to understand your choices, but I admit they've led to something unexpected. We'll see you at the wedding. E.H. It wasn't affection, but it was acknowledgement. And from her father, that was more than she had ever hoped for. Later that night, as she and Thomas sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, she leaned her head against his shoulder and exhaled. Do you realize what this means? She asked. That we've officially lost our anonymity? He teased. She nudged him. That we're no longer hiding. They see us. All of them. He kissed the top of her head. Let them look. We have nothing to fear. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind rustle the trees. She had spent so many years shrinking under the weight of judgment. Now she felt lighter than air. The next morning, she folded the newspaper article and placed it inside her wedding journal. The one where she'd sketched dresses and noted down vows and scribbled every fear and every joy of the journey so far. On the inside cover, she wrote, "They once said I'd never be chosen, that no one would want someone like me. Now the world is watching, but I'm not doing this for applause. I'm doing it because I found something real, and I won't hide it ever again." The morning of the wedding arrived quietly. No grand procession, no paparazzi, no servants rushing across polished marble, just the gentle rustle of wind in the trees, the distant chirping of birds, and the soft creak of floorboards as Eleanor stepped barefoot across the wooden floor of the cottage she now called home. She stood before the mirror in a simple linen robe, her hair loosely curled, pinned with sprigs of lavender and baby's breath. No diamond tiara, no heirloom necklace, just the natural elegance of a woman who no longer needed to be anyone but herself. Outside, the oak grove was already coming to life. Volunteers strung the last of the twinkle lights between branches. Tables were set with mismatched ceramic plates, and wildflower centerpieces gathered from the hills that morning. A handmade wooden arch stood at the heart of the clearing, wrapped in ivy and soft drapes of gauze. It wasn't grand, but it was beautiful, and most importantly, it was hers. When the guests began to arrive, Eleanor watched from the edge of the cottage garden. Her writing students came first, holding hand-painted signs and waving like it was a festival. Then came the older couples from Green Hollow, the florist who had donated the arrangements, and the farmer who brought honey every Sunday. They filled the space with laughter and lightness, their joy honest and unfiltered. Then, slowly, the Hawthornes appeared, not as one, but in scattered arrivals. Catherine, in a sharp lilac suit, arrived with her husband and 3 children. Isabel, always elegant, but less icy than usual, brought a delicate bouquet and an unreadable expression. A few uncles and aunts came too, many of whom had once whispered Eleanor's name like a disappointment. And finally her parents. They stepped from a dark sedan and stood silently for a long moment at the edge of the grove. Eleanor's mother wore navy blue, formal, flawless. Her father adjusted his tie, glanced around, and for the first time in Eleanor's memory, looked small, not diminished, but humbled. The ceremony began just after sunset. The golden light filtered through the trees like blessing. Thomas stood beneath the arch, his expression a mix of peace and awe as Eleanor walked down the grassy aisle, alone, but never more sure of herself. Gasps rippled through the guests, not because of her gown, a simple cream silk that floated when she walked, but because of the way she carried herself. This was no debutante on display. This was a woman arriving on her own terms. When she reached Thomas, he took her hand gently, reverently, and when the officiant asked them to speak their vows, they didn't pull out scripted words. They simply turned to each other and spoke from the heart. "I choose you," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Not because I was told to, not because it was expected, but because you saw me when no one else did." Thomas smiled, eyes glassy. "And I choose you, not because you fit anyone's mold, but because you broke free and taught me how to do the same." As they kissed, a cheer rose from the guests, soft and sincere, no orchestrated applause, just real emotion. And in that moment, Eleanor glanced past the arch, into the crowd. She saw her mother wiping a tear she would later deny. She saw her father clapping, slowly but genuinely. She saw Catherine smiling, and in their eyes, she saw not judgment, but something closer to pride. Eleanor didn't need it, but she accepted it, because this time it had been earned, not through obedience, but through truth. The wedding was over. The vows had been spoken, The laughter had echoed. Through the trees, and the stars now blinked overhead like tiny lanterns watching from above. But the night, and the celebration, was far from finished. The old barn at the edge of the property had been transformed. What once housed feed, saddles, and the quiet rhythm of horses now pulsed with music and warmth. Twinkle lights wrapped around the rafters, casting soft amber glows on the rustic wood beams. Wildflowers, gathered earlier that morning by Eleanor and a few of the younger guests, decorated every corner. A hand-painted sign at the entrance read, "Welcome to the dance. No titles, no roles, just joy." Guests arrived in clusters, still giddy from the ceremony. The air buzzed with stories and reunions, strangers mingling like old friends. Green, Hollow residents offered drinks to Hawthorne guests. Hawthornes complimented the homegrown decorations. And no one, not one person, brought up pedigree or politics. Because tonight, it didn't matter who you were, only how deeply you were willing to feel. Eleanor arrived last, her bare feet brushing the wooden floor as she stepped into the barn beside Thomas, his suit jacket now slung over one shoulder, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hair had come loose in the breeze, and her gown bore a few blades of grass from where she'd knelt with a child in the orchard after the ceremony. She was radiant, not in the polished way of society galas or debutante balls, but in the way of someone utterly at peace, fully herself, no longer trying to measure up to someone else's legacy. She had created her own, and it began right here, in the barn that now hummed with the sound of fiddles and laughter. The first dance was unplanned. There was no cue, no formal announcement. Thomas simply turned to her as the quartet struck up a new tune, something warm and slow, and extended his hand. "Dance with me?" he said, eyes full of the same wonder he'd carried since the day she'd first let him see her fully. Eleanor smiled. Always. They stepped into the open space at the center of the barn as guests gathered along the edges. No spotlight, no choreography, just two people swaying gently, forehead to forehead, spinning slowly under the lights. The room grew quiet around them, like a breath held in reverence. And then softly, others joined. Couples, young, old, unexpected, stepped onto the floor, some clumsy, others graceful, some dressed in linen, others in denim. And in that moment, the barn became more than a wedding hall. It became a symbol, a living declaration that joy did not belong to the elite. That love was not reserved for those with perfect pedigrees and long-standing names. That legacies could be rewritten, with laughter, with music, with barefoot steps on old wood. Later that night, Catherine approached Eleanor near the lemonade table. She had changed into flats and was holding a cookie in one hand, a content expression softening her usually rigid features. "You did it," she said, nodding toward the dancing crowd. "You really did it." Eleanor tilted her head. "Did what?" "You escaped. And somehow, you made it look easy. It wasn't." "I know," Catherine said. Then, after a pause, "I envied you. All those years. You had fire and silence. That's a dangerous combination." Eleanor smiled. "You can still choose differently, you know." Catherine looked down at her shoes. "Maybe one day." Then, without another word, she hugged her sister for the first time in years. Not out of obligation, but out of something that felt like respect. As the night wore on, stories were exchanged around the fire pit. Children fell asleep in their parents' laps. Elders shared memories of barn dances from decades past. Someone pulled out a guitar. Someone else sang an old folk song Eleanor hadn't heard since childhood. And then, near midnight, Eleanor stood on a hay bale and called for silence. She cleared her throat and smiled as the music faded. "I know we didn't do this the traditional way," she said. "We didn't have the ballroom or the orchestra or the 6-tier cake. But what we did have was truth. And I'm grateful you were here to see it." She paused, scanning the crowd. "And to those who once said I'd never." "Mary," she added, eyes twinkling, "I hope you're enjoying the view." Laughter rippled through the barn, but no one laughed harder than Eleanor, because it wasn't bitterness, it was victory. The next morning, when the barn was quiet again, Eleanor returned alone. She sat in the center of the floor, her wedding dress folded neatly beside her, her journal in her lap. She opened to a fresh page and wrote, "I was never meant to fit their mold. I was never meant to shine in their halls. I was meant to build my own. And now that I have, I will protect it with everything I am. Because this is more than a wedding. This is a beginning, and the legacy starts here."